This is Al Notzon. I'm doing a recollection at the request of my daughter Bridget, and I'll start with my early recollections of my mom. And I can recall that one song she sang to me regularly was three little fishes in a little bitty pool, and they swam right over the dam and would tickle me, and then telling me that I didn't have a first word. I had a first sentence, and it was I wet my bed. So that was, she was very proud of me. I'm not sure why, but she was. She, she was a beautiful piano player, very talented. She sang with the church choir, and she sang at all my events in school. And as a young boy, to have your mother being noticed for singing in a all boys school is not a good move, but I managed to survive that. Mom had an unbelievable vocabulary. I would come home and I'd try to stump her with a word that, when you have four hints, you can get it. But I would just say the word and she'd automatically give me the meaning without having to wait for any of the choices. Uh, she spoke Spanish fluently. Uh, she played the organ also at the church. She never argued with dad in front of us. I mean, that had to be hard for mom and dad, but they did it. I did not learn from them. Uh, Early on, I remember getting into a bucket of DDT, and they found me with it all over me, and it had seared my lungs, and I had breathing problems afterwards. Dad had bronchitis, and I had asthma, and we both took the same medicine. Uh, when I couldn't breathe, I'd get on all fours in my mind, thinking that as long as there wasn't weight, that my chest would actually, gravity would pull it down and I could fill my lungs. And as you might know, that if you can get your mind thinking that you found a cure, it works, and it worked for me. So that was my solution. I made my first communion and confirmation at 5. Had to be interviewed by then Bishop Garriga, who was an auxiliary bishop and lived in Laredo, and they had took me to the rectory, and I had to go into this big room, and he was in this large chair, and he had me sit down, and then started questioning me on what I knew about communion and what about the faith and so forth, and was pleased with my answers, and so I got to make it with my class, even though I was underage. Had my tonsils and adenoids taken out at 11. I had to have my baby teeth removed. They didn't come out on their own. I got braces, and in those days you had to sit still while they put a plaster cast inside your mouth in a metal tray that was water cooled, and you had to sit there and not move, because if you move, then it wouldn't give you a good form, and then they had to do it over again. The hard part is when you have hay fever like I did, and you couldn't breathe through your nose, and they had this huge thing jammed into your mouth and up against your palate. That was my torture for growing up, was my braces. Uh, Marcel was, as my older brother, was always the king of the hill. He was the one that had made a name for himself, and as long as I didn't get in his way, I was okay. But uh, if I didn't, he managed to discipline me. Uh, we went to a soapbox derby, and as we were riding, they gave us a ride in the back of a truck, and Dad said, "I'm going to go get the car," and he walked away, and then Marcel holds up the keys and says, "Oh, he's going to have a hard time starting the car. I've got the keys." And so I jumped for the keys, and Marcel pulled them away. And of course, I went over the side of the truck, which was moving. And the next thing I knew, I was in a very bright room, and I was looking down onto a bed, and I'm seeing myself in a bed and people talking about me. And then the next thing I knew, I was waking up, and so that was it was interesting. Uh, Not sure if they thought I was dead, but apparently I'm one of those near-death experiences at a young man. Uh, Frances was Dad's favorite. She was the girl that could do no wrong and loved to get Marcel and I in trouble and then run around the house with us chasing her just at the time Dad was coming home. So, of course, we would get spanked as a result of that. Uh, and one time we're playing in the back and we had this beautiful dollhouse with glass windows and she broke one of the windows. And so, of course, being a younger brother, went immediately running to tell Mom. She grabbed a piece of glass from the window and slung it at me, which managed to uh, open up a slice of it, sliced my arm, my forearm, and so I had to go get stitches. Uh, but somehow or other, she didn't get in trouble on that one. I think it was considered to be an accident. Was the way it was portrayed. Dad was larger than life. I remember him from his spankings and also being the authority figure. Mom used to threaten us with him. You know, wait till your dad gets home was a favorite expression. But I do remember also that he sold his prize rifle so to buy me a fancy bike that I had wanted for Christmas. And I found out later I didn't realize that he had to sell his rifle in order to do that. Uh, he offered me $1 if I could sit still for a minute, and I didn't even make a half a minute. I couldn't sit still. I was hyper. Uh, I remember he could fix anything. And one time in a car, we were coming back from St. Joseph's, and this car came out of a side street and almost hit us. So Dad pulled to the side and it missed. He then chased the car down and used a police technique to pull him over to the curb by cutting in front of him. Got out of the car, and I did too, not knowing what I could do. But Dad came to the side of the window and told the driver that he had endangered his family, and he was very upset with him, uh, rather loudly. And the guy said something like a curse word, and then next thing I knew, he was against. He was Dad hit him, and he went from the driver's side up against the door on the other side. Dad was very strong. He had a grip, and he was known throughout Laredo not to shake hands with him because he could make even the largest person get down on his knees by exerting hand pressure. Uh, he was very talented, a great speaker, uh, well thought of in the community. I always thought he should run for mayor, but he wasn't interested. Uh, let's see. I remember one thing too. One Sunday, I was in the kitchen and heard a crash from the living room and went into it, and Dad was on the floor, passed out. Uh, they took him to the hospital, and I remember that day I was at school, and at noontime we were having lunch, and I think I was with Philip, and all of a sudden I started crying. And Philip said, "What are you doing?" And I'm going, "I don't know. That's just I'm crying." And so then I went to football practice that day, and they called me out of practice and took me in pads down to the hospital, and I got there in time to see Dad die. Uh, that was a major change in our lifestyle, and uh, let's see, on the football practice field, I was always happy to leave. But that day it turned out not to be a good reason for leaving. But we were the dummies. They didn't have blocking and tackling dummies, so the lower classmen had to run, and you couldn't deviate when you saw this huge senior coming at you and blocking you, body blocking you, flying body blocks, and I mean you'd go for a good distance before you came to Earth, and then you'd have to come back in the back of the line and get ready to do it again. Uh, anyway, uh, I it, basically floated for 2 years. Mom was very busy with her mom, and I just, as a middle child, it's easy to hide out, and I was able to hide out and walk to school or walk back, and sometimes get a ride or sometimes not. And but I really didn't study, didn't do anything. I was not really interested in anything that was going on. Uh, Mom was actually involved with Grandmother Leindecker and working. And Grandfather Leindecker was a person you didn't cross. He was a typical old style German Opa. And I remember one time being in the garden next to the house on Houston Street, and all of a sudden Petra comes out and asks me that the grandfather wants to see me. So I go into the room, and he's sitting at the breakfast table with his meal and his paper, and sitting there facing the window, not caring who's around him. Everybody catered to him. This was his house. And he told me that children should be seen and not heard, and that he was only going to warn me the one time. Didn't say what he was going to do, but it was enough to put the fear of God in me. And so my grandfather Leindecker was not a loving figure. He was an authority figure. Uh, Grandmother Leindecker, though, was always, I mean, she was a beautiful lady, had beautiful eyes, uh, a little French nose, uh, just always gracious, always smiling, always happy to see us. She didn't raise their children, Petra did, uh, who was a fabulous cook and a fabulous housekeeper. And if you wanted anything in the Leindecker house, you went to Petra, because she knew where everything was, and would get it for you too. She was always doing things she shouldn't for us, making ice cream and doing things like that. Uh, Mom, she was one of Mom was one of her favorites too. Uh, let's see, I think Grandfather Leindecker was head of the Democratic Party in Laredo, and I think Grandfather Notzon founded the Republican Party. I think it was a party of one, him. Everybody else was a Democrat in those days in South Texas. Uh, he also, Grandfather Notzon, started the San Antonio Little Theater. He was an accountant or a cashier and worked for one of the banks. He had a drinking problem, and he died when he was 45, before I was born. And Dad had to leave school in the 10th grade to be able to support the family. Um, let's see, Mater, my Dad's mom, she was named Mater by Uncle Marcel, Father Marcel, my godfather, and he was being educated at the seminary. And Mater, of course, is Latin for mother. So she became Mater to all of us, and as a result of Uncle Marcel. Um, she was a phenomenal cook, and I remember her Christmas meals were just sumptuous. I mean, every dish was delicious, and she would make this huge white cake with frosting, and I can't tell you what it was. It was the most delicious cake I've ever had. So she was a natural baker, uh, and I think she that Dad bought the property that our house was on and her house was on, because we owned the property all through our house and in the back of Mater's house. And but as we were growing up, Uncle Miles, who was the baby of the family, was very territorial and thought all that land was his and would run us off. And Dad would make sure that that he wasn't overly abusive, but at the same time too, we couldn't backtalk him because he was one of our elders. Um, let's see, Uncle Roddy was Dad's younger brother, and unbelievably nice guy. He was by far our favorite uncle. And I recall when he got called to war, that we were saying goodbye to him, and I was asking him not to leave and not to leave. And so he gets ready and he gets in the car, and I grab hold of the bumper, assuming that I could stop the car. Well, he dragged me for about a half a block before they realized that I was holding on to the back bumper. Uh, so I skinned up my knees and didn't stop him from going to war. So I learned a lesson in those days that you might think you have superpowers, but you don't.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's see. Our chores at the house, we had to. I mean, it was a large yard, and we had a push lawnmower. And when you're small and the handles are higher than your head, it's hard to get any leverage to make it work. So you'd have to almost take a running start and make it go a little bit. I always wondered how Marcel was able to do it so much easier until I got a little bigger and realized what a difference that made. We also would clean out there were tangerine, orange, and grapefruit trees, and we would put little berms around them so you could water them and the water would stay close to the trees themselves. That was one of our chores, and also having to rake up around the hackberry trees. Hated those crash trees there, and the oleanders too would shed, or we would be getting them. Um, let's see. I remember Aunt Alice, who's my godmother. She was the youngest of the Landecker girls. She, phenomenal artist. She was my godmother, and I'd go to church, and she'd call me over, and I must have horrified her because I always had hay fever, and was always sniffling, and so she would give me her handkerchief, which was this beautiful lacy handkerchief, which she'd ask me to go ahead and keep, and so I thought she was the most beautiful person in the world, um, but anyway. I remember her sister and mom's older sister, Aunt Lamar. Aunt Lamar lived right behind grandmother in one of her houses, and her husband worked for the U.S. Marshal Service. And Aunt Lamar looked like my grandfather, uh, and so she smoked all the time. And when she'd come to our house, we had horny toads or horned toads, which we called horny toads. And she'd ask us to grab one. And so we'd get one and bring it over to her. And she'd take her cigarette that she was almost through with and put it into the horny toad's mouth. And the horny toad would actually draw in and puff out smoke. So she became known, obviously, as Aunt Horny Toad. Uh, let's see. Let's see. I got stung by a bunch of red ants in a field next to our house and declared war on them. And anytime I'd run into a red ant, I'd stomp it. And then I decided the smart thing would be to burn out the mound. So I got a can of gasoline and poured it all over and inside the mound, and then got a match and struck it and got a big whoosh, as you might expect. And then the fire got out of control and started to go toward the garage and toward the houses. And I'm running around, according to Francis, saying, Lordy, 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 Lordy. And it was a traumatic experience. And I forewent my war against red ants. Let's see. I had fantasy friends. I would love to sit in the bathroom and play aerial fights with all that was going on in the war. You'd have dog fights that would be on the newsreel, so I'd be reenacting them, and Marcel and Francis would jump into the bathroom and laugh at me because I was putting on a production. Um, see, I would on my roller skates, I would build little barriers and how many I could jump and how far I could jump, and so I was always performing. But as a result of that and my usual things, I managed to jump from one chair to another and missed the step and hit my tooth and broke off the front tooth. Um, the next time I broke my head, and I broke my head. I think it was a total of about, it was either 16 or 19 separate times that required stitches. And the first time they put whatever they were using for deadening, Novocaine or whatever it was. And after a while, I told the doctor, "Don't, I don't need the shot. Just go ahead and stitch." And so the first time he tried to argue with me, and I said, "No, no, just try it." He said, "Well, it's going to hurt." And so then when he finished, I said, "You know, it hurt less than the shot did." And I said, "I'd rather have just the stitches." So whenever I'd get stitched up, it would be without a shot. You develop a high pain tolerance, or maybe I had a high pain tolerance to start off with, but I know I didn't like the shots. Let's see. We were always playing outside. There was a climbing ladder that had to have at least 20 steps on it that were just bars, and we'd go up, see as high as you could. And of course, we were seeing all the films from the war with paratroopers being taught how to land and roll. So we were seeing how high we could go and jump and, not hit the ground and break our legs, but roll the way they're taught to in parachute school. And so luckily enough, we never broke a leg. I don't know. Dad had a lot of trust in us. He got us a merry-go-round, and of course, what we would be doing, and Marcel loved to do it too, was get you sitting on the edge and then just stand in one place and just keep pushing it faster, faster, faster until you could no longer hold on. And of course, then you'd fly off the merry-go-round. And that was a lot of fun. And then Dad had built a set of bars and swings and out of old oil field pipes. Nice design. Dad was an unbelievable designer. And so, of course, we were doing all our daredevil trips. Could you walk up a pole? Could you get to the top of it and walk across? And it had to be, I guess, at least a good, what, had to be over 15 feet above the ground. And we'd be going from one end to the other. It was a good distance, but we got to be little monkeys. Uh, let's see. Let's see. Little Alice was born 4 years after me, and at the time she was delivered, I think the cord wrapped around her neck, and she was deprived of oxygen for a while, and so when she was born, she always had a disability, couldn't speak, would point at things, and just she was the loveliest. I mean, she was a beautiful, beautiful girl, and she died when she was, I think she had to be either 4 or 5 when she died, but maybe even less. But I know Mom was very hurt by that, and of course, then Martin was born 8 years after me, and I was kind of hoping for a black baby, since St. Martin de Porres was black. Very disappointed when Martin came home and he wasn't. But that's between Martin and me. Let's see. Dad had a Jeep fixed up for Marcel, and again, he took an old Army Jeep and designed a roof for it. And on the side panels, he painted the school emblem, which was a deer with the antlers. It was the St. Joseph Antlers was our name of our team. And it was a phenomenal Jeep. Uh, Great ride. It was painted maroon and white, the school colors. And when Marcel went off to the seminary, it became mine. And of course, at that time, Marcel, I had my freedom. In fact, it took me 3 times to get my license for first. Oh, no problem on the written test. It was on the driving test that I would the instructor or the licensor would tell me to turn left, and I would, of course, would be in the middle of a block, so I'd turn up the alley, which was not what he wanted, or he'd say stop, and I'd bang him against the front windshield on the Jeep. So it flunked the first time, then I flunked the second time. I would pass the parallel parking. I'd pass everything, but it was one of these where my reactions were too quick. And he was thinking that he was telling me I would take the time to do it and I would immediately follow the instruction. Anyway, Judge Kazin, who was Dad's good friend, was walking by on the third time. And I said, hello, your Judge Kazin. And he said, now you take care of this young man. And to the driver, to the highway department guy. And surprisingly enough, I passed that time. You know, Laredo, it works that way. First day I had my license, I went to pick up Frances, and she's coming down, starts coming down one side. They're big curved driveways or walkways down to the street, and so I drive over to the place she's going to her. And so then she turns around and goes the other way. So I put it in reverse and back up. Of course, the Cadillac had just parked behind me. And as I was so upset with Frances, I did not do my checking. So the first day I had my license, I had my first wreck and broke the headlight on the Cadillac. And luckily, again, another Laredo, the lady was just very gracious. She said, no, don't worry about it. We won't even report it. I'll take care of it. So I had my license, my first wreck, and my first forgiveness all in one day. Oh, let's see. Yeah, Marcel came home after, seminary, and I think it was junior year in high school. And he took back the Jeep and managed to wreck it one night. So the Jeep went out of our life. I played football. I was an end and a safety. I was usually the fastest guy on the team because I ran track. I won the 100, the 200, the 220, the 440, and the 880 relays. I ran the hurdles. I did the broad jump. I did the pole vault. I did the high jump. And we were a small school. And as I said, I floated after Dad died. And then my junior year, Brother Michael Ray got in my face and asked me why I was not applying myself. And I told him, I'm passing him. I'm not in any trouble, am I? And he says, no, you're not in any trouble. You're just wasting this opportunity. You need to study. You need to get good grades. You need to do what. So he challenged me. And of course, that motivated me. And I went from middle of the class and I was the salutatorian. I probably would have, if I'd have started a little earlier, I probably would have been able to be the valedictorian, but it was close. Let's see. I think that pretty much what I thought I'd do is just cover my early years with you through high school. If that helps, I could have embellished it with stories about Mom's family and the stories they told me. But I think this might be a good stopping point for a first time.
Great.